Hi, everyone, and good evening. Welcome to tonight's session. This session is called What Makes a Good Board/Card Game Rulebook. I'm going to be one of your co-hosts tonight. My name is Dr. Dave Eng from universityxp.com. I'm also joined by my other co-host, Anne-Marie DeWitt, who is CEO of firesidegames.com. All right, so we have a lot of content to go over tonight in regards to what makes a great rulebook for your card or board game. But the first thing I want to talk about is our official host introduction. So again, my name is Dr. Dave Eng. I come to you from GameSpace Learning at universityxp.com. I also host both a YouTube channel and a podcast called Experience Points on using gamification, and game-based learning for teaching and learning online. You can find more of my work at universityxp.com. You can also email me directly at dave@universityxp.com. And up next, I'll let my co-host Anne-Marie DeWitt introduce herself. Anne-Marie, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Anne-Marie DeWitt. I'm co-owner of Fireside Games with my husband, Justin DeWitt. I'm using his Discord server, so that's why you see his name instead of my own there. We've been operating since 2009. Our first release was Castle Panic. It's a cooperative tower defense board game. It's great for families. So that's what we're most well known for. Dave and I were joking as we were setting up that people are more familiar with the brand Castle Panic than with the Fireside Games brand. So you'll know us most from that. So a lot of our games are very highly thematic, family-friendly games. Boards, card, and dice games.
Great, thank you, Anne-Marie. And before we get started, the one thing I want to tell everyone is that this presentation is based on an article on what exactly makes a great card or board game rulebook. If you'd like to download that article specifically, I'd go to that link that's going to be available at the bottom of the screen on every slide tonight. That link is bit.ly/game-rule. That's bit.ly/game-rule. All right, so this is going to be our content overview tonight. We have a lot of things we're going to cover. We're going to try to speed along this and try to answer some questions that you have at the very end of tonight's presentation. But the main things we want to touch upon on what exactly makes a really great rulebook is the purpose of the rulebook, striking a balance in your rulebook, writing and revising your rulebook over time, making sure you add statistical information to your rulebook, making sure that you also address components, theme, and provide a brief overview. Addressing setup in your rulebook, what players need to do in order to set up and play your game, the core loop, and specifically what players will be doing repeatedly during your game, what happens at the game end or how your game ends, organizing your content, making sure that you're curating the player experience, your specific voice when writing, testing your rulebook, addressing edge cases, and then some action steps that you can take away from tonight's session and apply it in your own rulebook writing. All right, so with that being said, I want to get started with our first content overview right here, which is the purpose of the rulebook. So the way we're going to set this up is I'll talk a little bit about this point, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Anne-Marie, and then we'll move on to the next point. So I'll start off with the purpose of the rulebook. And the main thing that I always focus on when I'm writing a rulebook for a game is that the purpose is to get your players playing the game as quickly as possible. One of the things I always like to emphasize is that players do not come to your game to read the rulebook. They come to your game because they want to play it. The rulebook is just one step in that process. So I always tell individual designers, and I always have to remind myself, that the rulebook is there as a necessary step in order to get your players playing. So that's my overview. Anne-Marie, do you have anything you'd like to say about the purpose of the rulebook when you've read or revised or written them yourself?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's, the rule book is a device to get them into the game, to get them playing as quickly as possible. And I think bearing that in mind, and the frame of mind of the player when they're coming to the game is important. So it's one component that helps them, one method that helps them to get into the game. I think it's important to be thinking kind of globally too about other components and how, what are other ways that you can get them into the game, such as how to play cards, things that, are brief reminders of the rules, things like that. So thinking of it as, just that one method for getting people into the game.
Great. All right, thank you, Anne-Marie. All right, so the next point I want to talk about with rulebooks specifically is making sure you strike a balance in your rulebook. And I say this because there are some designers that may come at rulebooks and really want it to be like an extensive, exhaustive guide. And then there are other designers that I've talked to and worked with before that really have just like a minimal rule book. They like to put together their components and really like leave the rule book to the last thing. And because they leave it at that point, it just doesn't get as much love and attention as other parts of the design process. So really the biggest point I have for designers here is that you have to strike a balance. A rulebook is not meant to be an exhaustive document about every possible situation that could happen in the game. And you also just shouldn't leave it to last in your design process. You should actually include it at individual and differentiated steps in your design process. But that's what I think about setting a balance in a rulebook. Anne-Marie, what do you think about balance in rulebook writing?
I would say that is one of the key things we wrestle with making sure we have that balance between detail and getting them into it. And we, like you, would err on the side of making sure that you have communicated like your core game loop, in making sure that you're getting people into the game and leaving the details either to sometimes we have a play details section at the end, so like the beginning will have what gets you into the game, and at the end maybe play details where you can go into some of those specifics that you might want to convey.
All right. Thank you. All right, so next point I wanted to start talking about here is writing and revising your rulebook. I brought this up a little bit before in striking a balance in your rulebook. And I know some designers that start out writing their rulebook as one of the first design processes. They have other designers that leave the rulebook at the very end. But I've kind of learned throughout my own practice is that writing and revising your rulebook should be done in incremental steps throughout the design process. Sometimes I have just taken a game concept and just written out what I think like a player should do in their individual turn, or I've just started with what I think are individual phases of the game that should happen. And that's okay, but one of the things that I always recommend other designers do is that when they playtest and when they have playtest notes, is that they are integrating those notes directly into their design, as well as reviewing and revising their rulebook throughout the way, so that it's an iterative process. What do you think, Anne-Marie? What do you think about writing and revising in the rulebook process?
Yeah, I would say when the game design is at a high level of volatility, you don't want to start, putting a lot of effort into the rules. But when, you're starting to kind of, tweak certain aspects of the game or certain rules, I think that's a good time, to start writing the rule book. And then we also have, and you may have this later. Oh no, you do have it later. So I'll save that for later on. But yeah, making sure that you're hitting that sweet spot of game design, and then starting your writing.
Great, thank you, Anne-Marie. Okay, so number 6. This is one of my pet peeves. I'll make sure I say this early. Is that whenever I look at new Kickstarter campaigns, and whenever I look at new games, particularly if I don't directly go to the BGG pages, I'm always looking for statistical information about the game. And when I say statistical information, I'm talking about the top 3 things that are usually on the front of every game box, which is how many players does it play, about how long does a game take to play, and also what is the appropriate age for players. And like I said before, one of my pet peeves is I'll go to a Kickstarter. This game looks really great. They've got really great and illustrative illustrations and graphic design and artwork and everything. But I cannot find how many players are supposed to play and exactly how long the game takes. And that's one of the first 2 things I'm always looking for. And because I'm always looking for those things, I always make sure that that is one of the first things that players see in the rulebook. How many players does this game play? The amount of time it takes to play a game, and also lastly, what is the appropriate age for players? What about you, Emily? What do you think about including this statistical information at the beginning of your rulebook?
Yeah, I mean, we have it on the front covers of our boxes, so you're not picking the box up unless it's kind of fitting those parameters, and helps with selection of the game. And then we always have it right on the front cover of the rule book as well.
Got it. All right, again, right. All right, so the next step is components here. I realize I've been leading off every point, but I want to give Anne-Marie enough time to discuss this. Anne-Marie, so I'd like to start with you. Where do you list components, or what part of the rulebook does components play for you when you're including it for your games?
We always list our components first, so when you open the rule book, it's kind of on the Verso side where you can, and we like to list them first so that people can do kind of an accounting of the game, make sure that they all the components and are familiar with them before they get into the game.
Oh, okay. So I have a question here, Anne-Marie, and I'd like your professional input. When other designers are listing components in their game, do you feel like it's best for them to list, like, we would say, like, game-specific components, like 6 merchant cards, 6 player cards, or should they just list, like, 96 total cards in the game? Like, how have you listed it in the past?
We always break it out into
Okay.
the subsection, and then we also like to give visuals of each of the components. So so we're starting to put that one-to-one correlation, and people know where to look to get a visual reference for a game component, so that as they're reading, where we may not have an image of it, they can always reference back to the components and see the image and know exactly what we're talking about. But yeah, I would break it out so that it creates kind of a nice reference tool, when they're digging into the rules.
Right. Yeah, I know that I've run into issues like that in the past where a game will list in its rulebook under components like this game includes 9 merchants, but it doesn't tell you what the merchant component should look like. Is it the pawns? Is it the cubes? Is it something else? So that's important as well. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
All right, so the next area I want to talk about is theme in your game. And I know that a theme relates to games in many different ways. It can be very highly thematic games, and there are also like abstract games. But one of the things that I'm always looking for in a rulebook is the theme in terms of who the player is in the game. One of my all-time favorite games, and one of the games I have one of the most plays of, is Azul. And Azul being, like most would call it an abstract game, doesn't really have a lot of theme, I would say. It has a lot of really great-looking pieces and components. But one of the things I really appreciate about the Azul's rulebook is that at the beginning it tells you exactly who you are. Which you are Azulejo, you are laying tiles in this, I think, Portuguese cathedral. And while that may not come through in each individual play of Azul, I still appreciate that it was part of the rulebook. So what about you, Henry? Where does theme come in for you with rulebook writing?
Yeah, that's exactly the way we handle it as well. We give you the story up front, so this is, the reason you're playing the game, this is the world you've entered into, and then we kind of rely on, the graphic design elements and, the illustrations that we have to communicate that world. We don't, we've tended not to kind of thread theme throughout the rules and have them, highly thematic. I know some people do, and it's a fun read, but we have found that it gets in the way of comprehension, and when space is a hot commodity, we want to make sure that we're using that space in a way that is communicating as concisely as possible. So that's how we usually deal with theme.
I see. All right. Thank you, Henry. Next area I wanted to talk about was providing a brief overview in the rulebook. And I realized that some rulebooks include these, some don't. But I find that this is a really great way to cater to the player experience. And when I talk about a brief overview, what I really mean is like, now that we've explained the components that are included in this game, the overall theme, the brief overview would be like, okay, this is who I am. In this game, it's broken up into, say, like 5 different rounds. In each round, they're going to be doing 1 or 2 things, and all players do that until X, Y, and Z happens, and when X, Y, and Z happens, that triggers the end of the game. And you add up how many victory points or how many stars you've earned or anything else, and that is how the game resolves. So I believe that brief overview is really great from me as from a consumer standpoint, trying to comprehend, like exactly what is happening in this game on a regular play of it. But Emery, what about for you? What about any of the titles from Fireside Games where you've provided this brief overview, or when you've seen like a brief overview of other rulebooks?
Yeah, so that's you have my favorite subject. That's you're really when you're trying to get them into the game, it's like as a game designer, when you've been working on this, like you understand it like an image, like a poem, like this really tight compacted idea of what this game is, so we have a game, Dastardly Dirigibles. Here, I'll show the cover there.
Okay.
And then just as an example in the rule book, so we have see if I can hold that up. So we have like play at a glance where, and we actually put it ahead. Well, we do the setup and then we do that play at a glance to be like, if you want to just read this at a glance, get a sense of how to play, and then get into it. You don't necessarily even have to read the rule book, to get into the game and get started. You could read as you go. That to me always helps get that core idea, so that even if you do continue reading the rule book before you start playing, you've got this whole complete gestalt, of the game before you're, diving into the specific details. So I think that's really important.
And Anne-Marie, am I correct in assuming that you have that there in order to get your players over that hurdle of having to go through the entire rule book so that they can just see, okay, like play at a glance, I get the gist of what's going on here, and if I have additional questions, I'll continue reading on. Is that
That's
what you're
right.
trying to accomplish? Okay.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Thank you, Anne-Marie. All right, so the next point I wanted to talk about here is setup. And I know Anne-Marie talked about it before. The one thing I wanted to add about setup here is that if your game has a different setup requirement for different number of players, that's one of those things that you should share right off the bat. Like if it's a game that plays 2 to 8 players, say it's like a pretty versatile like party game, what is that setup going to look like for 2 players versus 7 players or 6 players or anything else? And the other thing that I really appreciate for images overall is when there is an image in the rulebook of what a complete setup looks like for 3 or 4 players, and then in the step-by-step process, it just has arrows to what is being set up at that point. Or what I see a lot of rulebooks doing right now is they'll have like a letter, and that letter corresponds to something that is on the setup diagram. Anne-Marie, have you done that before in your rulebooks, or seen other like great applications of that setup method?
Yes. I'll show you. The setup we did here. Now this is for Dastardly Dirigibles. So you've got, we did the components where you can see, the individual components, and then when you put it all together, there's the setup. So that's our preferred method. We tried with, I think it's Dead Panic, which is the worst rule book we've ever put together, and we've got the worst feedback on that one, and that's a whole story in itself. But we tried an experiment with that one where we had, instead of having components and setup separate, we had the setup, and then we listed the components just by drawing arrows and having labels that went to wherever the components were set up, and that got way too busy. You could probably do that with a simpler game, but we had way too much going on. It was too confusing. So we tend to separate those out.
Oh, I see. Was that the reason why, Anne-Marie, that you said that Dead Panic was, like I guess one of the most critically examined rulebooks, or the reason why a lot of players didn't like using it?
So with that one, it actually came to, we did not do any play testing or of that rulebook. By then, we were so confident in our rulebook design that we didn't think we needed a play tester. We're like, we understand how people come to rulebooks. We understand the ins and outs, and we got cocky and thought well, we don't really need to take that extra time. Let's go ahead and get it in production, yada yada. Boy, did we learn how important play testing your rules are. So we don't, and it always surprises us when we play test, like what the feedback that we'll get. Well, because we are very organized and careful about how we present all the information, and we have all this experience with it, and we'll always think through it. And some, groups will always come to your rule book in ways that you could not have imagined, and, things that were confusing that you're like, but that should be clear, and the way you think about it and process it and approach it is different from the way other people do. So it's really important to,
I know that we have testing later, and I wanted to add a few things there. So let's, I'll wait till we get to that point.
Yes, that sounds good.
All right, so the core loop it's a term that I use on a regular basis. I know that some other designers and publishers will address it as well, but when I'm looking at the core loop in a game, I'm always looking for the, like, what is a player going to be doing on their turn? Or if it's a simultaneous action game, what are people going to be doing on a regular basis until the game ends or resolves itself or anything else? And what I see happening a lot when designers decide to describe their core loop is they talk about main mechanics. They talk about like action drafting or worker placement or set collection or anything else, and that's good to know. However, and we'll talk about it later when when we discuss voice and writing, is that if you are designing, say, like a gateway game, other players who are new to the hobby, they may not know what set collection is, or they may not know what worker placement is. So I think it's always good in your core loop to say, like, this game involves set collecting, which means that this game has 6 different symbols, and each complete set of 6 symbols will earn you more points throughout the game. But for you, Anne-Marie, what have you seen, or in your games, how have you described like this core loop of like the actions that are happening on a regular basis for players?
Yeah, we tend to try to handle that in 2 different ways. One, we'll do like bullet points, without explaining them on, usually the back of the box, so that, people who are familiar can get kind of at a glance, the same way with the statistical information. But then when we are providing kind of more of the flavor of the game, and that's when we move away from, that kind of lingo, and just describe, what it is that you're doing, and then make sure that inside the rules, that when we have the play at a glance, making sure the core loop is laid bare without, all of the lingo. So.
Okay. And when you say laid bare, can you be more descriptive of what in like specific terms you've used in the past in your rulebooks?
So let me see if I can, so with this one, so we have it, organized. We like to use bold-faced bullet points and pictures a lot in our rule books. So we'll, in this one we've bold-faced, the 3 major, steps that you're going to take. You're going to play 3 rounds, and you're going to score your airships and determine the winner. So then within play 3 rounds, that's where I would say we lay bare, where we, make it very clear what you're doing. So you draw up and you perform 3 actions, and those are bold-faced as well. So that's what you have to pay attention to. Then in light face and bulleted, we go into what performing the 3 actions are and what your options are. You can play an airship or special card. You can discard a card. You can swap 1 card from your hand with 1 card from the Emporium. You can replace the Emporium. You can pass. So just in that play at a glance, just really, making it ultra clear, what your options are, along that. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you, Emily. So based on that vein so far, I want to talk about like the game ends. So now that you've addressed in your rulebook, like what the core loop is, but what your individual players are going to be playing, where exactly do you include that content on like the game ends at X, Y, and Z, or like this triggers the end? How have you written that in the rulebook in the past?
So we include that in 2 places. One, at the play at a glance, so score your airships at the end of each round, and then at the end of 3 rounds, you determine the winner, and here's how, very briefly. And then we always have at the end of the details section like ending the round and then scoring. So we make sure that it has its own heading, and that it's easy to find through the navigation language that we have set up in the rulebook itself. So
I see.
Yeah.
And in that section too, Henry, do you include like any tie-breaking
Yes.
activities or anything else? And do you have like a specific, I guess, philosophy for how ties are broken in the games you've designed?
I don't know if we have a specific philosophy. Well, I would say that we always make sure that it's tied back to how, difficult or easy something was to accomplish within the game itself, so that if you're, let's say, left with some resources at the end, and maybe those resources aren't included in the scoring, but maybe, they indicate, how well you did something or how poorly you did something, using those as kind of a tie break situation to reflect, how well you used your resources. So that might come into play, that sort of thing. So, but we usually try to go down 2 levels of tie break. So, if you go to 1 level and that there's a possibility that there's a tie there, how do you determine that, the winner of that tie as well? And if we go beyond a 3rd, we usually put like a joke in there, so it's like if you're having to go 3 levels down and you can't determine a winner, and we'll have some kind of theme related joke around tying. So.
I remember one of my favorite funny related tiebreakers is in Mintworks. And in Mintworks, I think one of the third or fourth level tiebreakers, it's whoever's score is closest to 42. That's the person who wins.
Yeah.
I think you provided really great insight there, Anne-Marie. Thank you. The only thing I would add, though, is that at least a lot of the games that I play, there's a differentiation between triggering the game end and like actual game end, like scoring. Some games I play is like the game just ends immediately once X, Y, and Z happens, whereas other games are like, like if so and so happens, kind of like in I'm trying to blank, like Splendor, whenever the last noble is claimed, you still play until everyone has an equal number of turns. Same thing with like Century Spice Road or anything else. So I would tell designers to also make sure that they differentiate. Like the game will end at this point, and that's like an end game trigger, and then you do something else, and then you do final scoring. So that's the only other thing I would add.
Yeah, and then where you place that in the rule book, whether it's under the, heading about ending the game or in that last, whatever the action is, whatever the play is, that can be some, a decision you need to make about, the best placement for that.
Right. And speaking about specific placement, the next part is organizing your contents. And for me, the way that I've organized my contents in the past or my rule books is basically what you've seen in this presentation, like the statistical information, components, theme, brief overview, setup, core loop, and game end. I find that is the way that I would read a rule book, that I hope the way that other players read a rule book. Although I still think it's worth it to have blind playtesters read your rule book and learn how to play that way. It's also really worth it to have an editor read and review your rule book. So I think the way you organize your content is really going to speak to that next point about player experience. But I wanted to ask you, Anne-Marie, like, what is your I guess what is your workflow? How do you organize the contents of your rule book?
Yeah, very similar to what you're saying. The only thing that we tend to wrestle with is, how much detail, to include in the the core loop section, and then is it better to just deal with exceptions or some of that more detailed information in a separate section under play details, which would be after the end. So it might be kind of a reference section, that they would use. So yeah.
Okay. And I would say that one of the things that I really like about organizing the contents of your rulebook is that you should always do so knowing that it's going to be that, again, like it's that step in the playing process where someone has got to read your rulebook in order to play the game. I don't know if any other viewers have the game In the Year of the Dragon by Stefan Feld, but one of the things I really like about the rulebook is that it's broken up really into two parts, but it's all in the same document. The left part of the rulebook has all of the detailed steps about setup and what individual things mean. But on the right-hand side of the rulebook is like a column, and that column just has like a quick bullet point summary. Like in this phase, you do this. In this phase, you do that. And I really appreciate that because I played it before. I know how the game plays, but if I haven't played it for like months or years, I need a quick refresher. I know I can always go down the side of that the rulebook for that individual outline. Have you observed that in the past for any other of your other rulebooks, Anne-Marie?
Yeah. So I think the kind of the side navigation that you're talking about. I think that's what our play at a glances do for us. And then I also make sure the head structure is really really outlines the game and allows you to quickly find the content that you're looking for.
Right. And I think all of that, everything we've discussed so far in organizing our contents fits into that player experience where one of the things that I struggle with, because I tend to be a very comprehensive writer, is that like right now I'm designing a very light, just a party card game. That's its only components. It's meant to be very light, an entry-level card game. But the rule book is longer than I'd like it to be. Like it's at 3 pages in a Word document right now, and I just wish it was 1 page. So I think for me, when I'm talking about the player experience, I know that, okay, this game is going to be a light, entry-level card game. I need to have the rule book reflect that. Where have you integrated like what you want your player to experience, Anne-Marie, when you are writing the rule books for your games?
That's such an excellent point. That the length of the rule book and the experience of the rule book should match the experience of the game,
Mhm.
and what you're trying to communicate with the game.
Mhm.
And yeah, we can have a like when we came out with Stringamajig, which is right behind me there.
Mhm.
Um, it, at first it was like this longer role, and we're like, this is an easy game, like it should be quicker, to get them in, and that's where you want to edit down, make as concise as possible, which is why we don't use a lot of thematic language because
Mhm.
we want to get you into it and get you it's about experiencing the game and when you're thinking about your audience and that player experience of the rule
Mhm.
book, I think the number one thing to remember is they don't want to be reading. So how do you have this written material? Like it's
Mhm.
designed for people who don't want to be doing what you're asking them to do.
Right, right.
So we try to bear that in mind, and that's where concision comes in. You
Mhm.
know, head style navigation, making sure you're bold facing,
Mhm.
bullet points, pictures, the things that make it the easiest for them to get in and out of that rule book and get into the game. And then
Right,
we usually always have a link. We do videos, in a nutshell videos, and then how to play videos. And then
right.
we provide a URL in the rule book too up front. So it's like, if you don't even want to read these, if you just want to watch, the video, you can just go right to that. So in a nutshell, it's like 1 minute overview, gets you into it,
Mhm.
and then the how to play is kind of a more extensive, it's like a video rule book. So,
Right, right.
um, yeah.
And I think that speaks to the next point here, which is your voice when writing your rule book. And I think one of the most incisive pieces of advice I've gotten about rulebook writing is that write your rulebook as if it is going to be read out loud by one person to a table of people that may not want to listen to you. And like as negative as that sounds, I mean I've been in that position many many times. Like a lot of people and a lot of the my friends that are in my play group, we come to games knowing that like one person has the job of explaining it to everyone else, and we
Yeah.
empathize with that person because we've been in that position before. We know how difficult it can be. But especially if you play with a lot of casual gamers or people that don't play regularly,
Yeah.
you need to curate that experience. So,
Mhm.
what about you, Andrew? What do you think about the specific voice when you write a rulebook?
Yeah. So at first, when I read this in the outline, I was thinking very literally, like, first person, second person, third person, and we do use second person because
Mhm.
we used to use third person, and it distanced the reader, from the material, and so it's always second person. It's you do this, you do that, um, and and making sure that voice, the tone also matches the tone of the experience.
Mhm.
So like when I did Stringamajig, at first I did this kind of like you know uh, almost kind of a sarcastic, kind of funny, tone, and it was fun and funny to read. But Justin was like, "It's not really a sarcastic game, though."
Mhm.
So trying to make sure that that you're using a tone and using a voice that communicates that play experience in a kind of a one-to-one way.
Right, okay. And I think I've seen this very infrequently, but I want to know, Emery, if you've seen it as well. But when we talked about game theme before, some rule books will integrate that game theme and how they explain the rule book. But
Yep.
sometimes that is done in a way that where it makes it actually hard to understand what the design
Yes.
is trying to communicate to me. Have you seen that before?
Yes, yes, and that is exactly why we don't do it,
Yeah, yeah,
because what you're trying to do is to clearly communicate,
right.
what how to play the game,
Mhm.
and when the theme, starts to muddy that, I mean, why are you writing the rule book,
Right. Yeah, again, it's like
So,
that player experience. You're there to explain how to play the game because they're not
yeah,
there to read your rule book. They're there to play.
yep, that's right, that's right.
So I know we touched on this before, and I know that I think we have a lot to share at this point. But testing your rule book, Anne-Marie, I'd like to start with you. Like, what challenges have you run into with playtesting one of your games with like a blind playtest, where you just give them your players the rule book and have them try to learn and play the
Yeah,
game from there?
yeah, the hardest part, is being quiet, and and trying to let them work through the rule book to find, because you know once they read the rule book and you're sitting there watching them read the rule book and then they start at the game, they'll have questions, and they're used to, because these are often people that we playtest, the game design. Now we would never use the same groups to playtest the rules as we do the game design, because they've already played it, they already know, they don't really need the rule book. So it's always someone fresh to the game, for the playtesting, and then, trying to be quiet, while they look for the answer. So when they come up with that question, they look to you to remind them, we're testing the rules to make sure, that you would, if I weren't here, you'd be able to find the answer to your question, and so sometimes, they look to me, I'll say, well, do you think you would be able to, where would you, look in the rule book to find that answer? And, sometimes cueing them back, kind of gently, and helping them to remember, like, we're not testing your ability to read the rules, we're testing our our ability to communicate through the rules, so they can feel judged, when they're playtesting those rules. So trying to remind them that any difficulty in reading the rules is not a reflection of them, it's a reflection of of the rules, and that's great. We're looking for those tough spots and where we haven't communicated what we thought we were trying to communicate. So
right. I would add that, so my background is in higher education and academia. I teach and write and research. So one of the things I've been able to rely on are some of the colleagues in my field that may not even be related to the game industry at all. And I have one colleague who's also my co-designer, and he's a technical writer. So sometimes I will write a rule book, and I will just give it to him and say, like, I want you to try to find some flaws here, because I know he will always be able to find flaws. And then I also have other colleagues that are writers, and again, not involved in the game industry. They're writers. They write for different publications and different modalities. And I just say, like, here's a rule book for a game I'm working on. Is it clear? And then they can review it from a writing standpoint. So that's the thing. Like, if you have other colleagues, they don't even have to be involved in the game industry. To just have them read your rule book as written, they can often provide really insightful feedback.
Yeah, but never substitute that for actual playtesting.
Yeah, you should have them playtesting. But I would say, like, the number one takeaway would be, like, have other eyes other than your own eyes review your book. Yeah.
That's it. Use strong editorial processes. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
For sure.
So the next point I want to talk about is edge cases, and I think that this is valid to bring up because they're, like, when you're writing a rule book, I don't think it should ever be completely 100% comprehensive, because there's not every instance of a game end that you can you can talk about in your rulebook. But there are going to be some edge cases that come up in a lot of different games. And I would say that one of the most common ones that I have run into with games are component limitations. Like, if I'm playing a game and I run out of this specific component, is that a game design decision, or should I substitute it with something else? So those are one of the most common edge cases that I've run into as a player, and also try to address it as a designer. What about you, Anne-Marie? Have you addressed edge cases in your rulebooks and your designs?
Well, we try to design out the edge cases as much as possible, so that you're not having to, kind of have, a lot of if-then. But when the ones that we aren't able, to kind of either design away or, add more components, that sort of thing, that's where we kind of add that to the play details at the end, that we were talking about. So unless we can concisely, include it, within the, core set of rules,
Right.
we would do it there. Yeah.
I know that in the article I wrote about what makes a great card, or what makes a great rule book, one of the pieces of advice I got about edge cases was that there was a designer that was writing a rule book for their game, and that they had one bullet point in their edge case about one specific card and what it does in the game and how it could, like, affect other cards. And it got to the point during playtesting that edge case was like a real sticking point for playtesters. And then one of his colleagues just said, well, I mean, if it's a sticking point, then just get rid of it. Like, it's taking up all this room in the rule book. It doesn't seem to be adding to the experience. It's not fun. So why is it? That's one of those questions you got to ask yourself.
And those can be tricky because sometimes those little, like, extra experiences kind of can really add to the game, and then sometimes it's like it's just complication. Like, just axe it, So
All right, so I think we're wrapping up, and I see there are some questions in the chat right here, so we'll just finish off with this one. So the last one here is just action steps. So what can you all, as designers, do right now in order to start improving your rulebook writing process. So I'll talk about one, and I'll turn it over to Anne-Marie to talk about one or a few that you have to offer up. But my number one action step is that even if you're conceptualizing a game at the very beginning, I think it's helpful to start writing your rules. And sometimes I start out with just like a post-it note where I come up with a game idea, and I will just write down like some bullet points about what I think players can do or should do in the game. And while some people may consider that like a brainstorming document, that can also be the basis of your rulebook going forward, because that would really fill out the core loop. So my advice is, if you're starting out, even if you just have just an abstract idea, is to just write down some bullet points of what players can do, because you can always use that information later to start authoring and drafting your rulebook. And of course, that will change and grow and iterate as your game evolves. But what about you, Andrew? What are some action steps that people can do to improve their writing process?
Yeah, I love this sticky idea, and making sure that you're making those notes, because a lot of times when you have those fresh ideas, sometimes you can kind of lose the idea. So
Right.
making sure to include those. And the other ideas, I think, it depends on kind of what your level of experience is. But I guess I would just instead just have kind of a note of encouragement that that writing rule books is hard, and that even when you think you've got it down, you're always learning, so give yourself a break, and try your best, utilize all these best practices, but know that it is iterative, and that you're constantly learning. Every game is a new challenge with a rule book, and one solution for one game does not necessarily translate, one to one for another one. But there's some really, strong best practices that you can use that will, help you to have the best rule book you can.
And Anne-Marie, is there a rule book that you've written, or a rule book that you've read for another game that you're particularly proud of, that you think that other designers should look at?
Oh, that's a good question.
If you need time to think, I can talk about two that I think are
yeah,
pretty good.
you go right ahead. You go right ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you're so all those that are watching right now, there are two rule books and two games that I think are really great at explaining everything that we talked about so far. So one of them is Montana by Rudiger Dorn. And the reason I like that game is that I wouldn't consider it a gateway game. I think it's a little bit more complex than that. But the way that the rulebook is laid out, and specifically, this is one thing I always look for in games, the way that the components are laid out is it makes it really hard for you to forget how to play. And that's one of the things I really, really love about like my top 10 games, is that I may not play it for 2 or 3 years, but if I just bring out the components and I look at the components, from Montana, I remember how to play that game. The second rule book that I would recommend is I just got my Kickstarter delivered for it. It's the Gugong by Game Brewer, I think. I'm not exactly sure. But I think, again, that game I would not consider light at all. I consider maybe like medium heavy Euro, in my opinion. But I think that's another rule book that does really well at explaining the layout, the setup, the core loop, the different phases of the game. And like Montana, it goes out of its way in order to demonstrate to players exactly how the game progresses and how it plays. And for me, those are huge wins, because if I don't even have to dive into the rulebook, again, going back to the player experience, then that's a huge win, because I can spend my time and my energy and my patience playing the game rather than trying to dive into the rulebook. So those are my two. It's Montana and also Gugong. Those are my two really exemplars for rulebooks. But what about you, Anne-Marie? Anything that you would recommend?
So other games, outside of our catalog, I can't. I mean, there's certainly rule books that have, I've gotten into, better than others. I think maybe I remember Bunny Kingdom, being really easy to get into, and to understand those rules at a glance. In terms of our own catalog, one that I don't get a lot of questions about is the Village Crone, and so that one might be worth taking a look at it as well. So,
All right,
yeah.
great. So I see there are some questions here in the chat. We're going to be addressing those in a moment. Again, I just wanted to thank my co-host, joined tonight by DeWitt, who is the CEO of Fireside Games, and I was the other co-host. My name is Dr. Dave Eng from universityxp.com, where I talk about using games for teaching and learning. And I brought this up at the very beginning. Tonight's presentation was put together based on an article I'd written a while ago, which is called What Makes a Good Rulebook. If you'd like to download, or not download, if you'd just like to access the article, you can take your mobile phone and just open up the camera and point it at that QR code that you see on the screen, and you'll be able to get a link to that article to read the full list, in addition to some other games that I think have really great rule books. And if you want a template for writing your own rule book, there's a link there in that article at the very end, so I recommend you check that out. So I know we have about 12 minutes left, so I'd like to take this time to address some of the questions in the chat that a lot of our viewers have been patiently waiting for answers on. Let's see, I think I can look at the chat over here, and I will see if I can scroll up to see some of the questions in the... Oh, okay. Virginia, any questions we can answer?
Virginia muted.
Oh, okay. I don't know. Well, wait, I think I can see it here.
Okay.
So one question is pros and cons of icons, so such as card backs, card anatomy in the rulebook. I'll turn to you first, Anne-Marie. Where have you used those icons in your rulebooks in the past?
Yeah, we always include those icons in the rules. So whenever we, at first mention of, look for this icon, to see blah, 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 we always have, a picture, a little image of that icon at use. So.
I would say that I typically use it pretty frequently. One of my favorite websites that I use on a regular basis is the Noun Project, because they just have like this seemingly endless collection of icons. I know there are other options out there, but I use that website pretty frequently. So I would also recommend the same thing, using icons in your rulebook. But like Anne-Marie and I talked about it before, you definitely need to take some time to revise your rulebook, because I have gotten to situations where I've replaced an icon later on down the design process with something else, but my rulebook references a different icon, or it calls an icon one thing in one location and calls it something completely different in another location. So I would just be very careful about naming your icons and using them on a regular basis and consistently.
And I would add, if you're going to reuse an icon that's been used elsewhere, make sure you know the history of that, and because it can become freighted with, other meanings. So we usually have unique, IP, for all of our icons for that reason.
Right.
But yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, that's a good that's a good insightful point. Considering like if that icon is used somewhere else, it could mean something.
Yeah.
Different.
Yeah.
So the other question we have in here is, do you consider the physical properties of rulebooks, i.e., page size, fitting the box, page count, or for even spreads, thickness for fitting inside, etc.? So I don't have a lot of experience there. Anne-Marie, do you have any insight on like specific like physical properties of your rulebooks?
Yeah, absolutely. We always have the trim size of the rulebook. That's the same as the trim size of the box. So when you open the box, the first thing you see is the rulebook sitting there, nice and pretty. And then the thickness and how the feel of it. We don't want to. That's where it can you can have more or less expense, So we usually try to have a paper that, feels decent, but it doesn't overdo it, So we usually have like some bend to it, but that it feels, it feels pretty good, Yeah, not too thin, but it doesn't need to be, you don't want to overproduce it. It doesn't need to be super stiff,
Have you had a chance to handle like the scythe or wingspan rulebook?
Yeah.
Would you say that is like a premium quality, like in terms of paper and everything type of rulebook?
Yeah, wingspan the whole game, yes.
I just say that because when I picked it up, I felt like I was holding like a restaurant menu. I was like, "What is this?"
That's exactly what we said. That's
Maybe I should
exactly
spend time reading the book.
Yeah. Well, and if it's a deluxe, if it's a Kickstarter and you're paying for that, that's another, another thing. So, and then he asked about page count too, or she asked about page count. And then, I think we kind of talked about that earlier. You don't want to overdo it or underdo it. It should fit the weight of your game, so you don't want to have a quick party game that's 18 pages long,
Yes, I'm fighting that battle right now.
Yeah.
I skipped over one question before. So this question was, with the understanding that more complex games will have larger rule books, is there an optimal number of pages for a rule book that you aim for? So I think we addressed this a little bit before about like heavier games needing more rules, lighter games needing less. What do you think, Andrew? Do you shoot for like an optimal length for your rule book or anything like that?
Well, I mean, we always try to, like, if it's longer, a more in-depth game, I still do try to fit it on as few pages as we can. I mean, obviously, if it's a more in-depth game, you're not going to fit it on, 4 sheets. But like usually ours will, 12 to 16 pages, and then usually you want to think in terms of 4, because every sheet is going to translate into 4 pages when you have your rule book, just by the way it's manufactured. So kind of thinking in terms of 4s and how you're going to deal with the information. And if things start getting too crowded and you don't have enough pictures to help guide, then that's when you might want to expand to another sheet.
Right. And another thing that I would bring up here, and I think this is really smart for this publisher to do, if you've ever played Root, which can be a very in-depth game for people who've never played games with like asymmetric factions or anything else, I think they did a really great job of separating really the rulebook into 2 different components. One is a quick start playing now guide, and the other one is like a comprehensive like bullet point by bullet point. If this happens, do this kind of thing. So at that point, like people can say like, I want to play now. I'm going to start with this document, and then like I played it 10 times, but I have this nuanced rule I want to find out more about. You go into the comprehensive document.
I forgot about Root and their rule book. When we played it, Justin and I commented on that too, like, and how nice it is to be like, oh, I can get into, because usually we have those incorporated together. So that actually is a rule book that we're thinking about. Do we want to use that to help manage, the play details versus the, getting you into the game.
Right. All right, so there's another question we have here, Anne-Marie. So it said, how do you feel about having a cheat sheet cards along with a rule book, quick references on hand for each player?
Absolutely, yeah, we do that every game. We have our little, we call them the order of play cards, and then it's those are the cards that with our games that if you have forgotten you've played, but it's been a year and you pull out the game, you don't want to read the whole, rule book again, you can just look at those order plays and then it triggers, how to play the game.
Right.
And then it's just a nice reminder, for everyone, so that and we make sure there are enough of those cards to go around, so that everyone can have their own, so that it's not, the experience where just one person has the rule book and knows and owns, kind of the rules, but everyone has in front of them, like, here are the basic ways, so you don't have to keep asking, can I see the rules, and I've forgotten how that, so it kind of, it helps that player experience.
So let me ask you this, Anne-Marie. So I like it. I like having those those cheat sheet cards. However, I really prefer them to be a different dimension of the other cards in the game. So like if the game has bridge size or poker size cards, I like the cheat sheet cards to be like tarot size. Have you ever made that distinction in your games?
We have, and for me as a player, I don't necessarily, need, those differences. So we have some games where it's the same, like the order play cards for Castle Panic are the same as the Castle cards, but then with Dastardly Dirigibles, you have tarot size, cards that you're playing with, and then, the order of play with them. I think we had a different size on that. Oh no, actually we had it on the play mats. So you have it, along the side there instead. So we change it up, with different games depending on, and some of it can be cost. So it's like if we can have that added cost and that different cut, and it's not going to hurt, the price point too much, we can incorporate that, but yeah, we don't have a hard and fast rule for it.
I see. All right, great. So it looks like we got one more question here, and the question is, how do you feel about Oh no, wait, we just asked that one. So I think those are all of the questions. I think those are all the questions that were asked here. Doesn't look like there's anything else in there. It looks like we have about 3 minutes left. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to just thank everyone for coming out for this presentation. I sincerely appreciate it. I'll turn it over to Anne-Marie first. So Anne-Marie, how can people get in contact with you? How can people pick up some great fireside game titles?
Oh, thanks. Well, first, I just wanted to thank you, Dave, for all the work that you did putting the presentation together and organizing everything. I really appreciate that. So, to get in contact with us, our social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. It's all, Fireside Games is the name for all of those accounts. You can go to our website. We have a contact us. So if you wanted to fill that out and ask us any questions, and that's firesidegames.com. We also have a YouTube channel, Fireside Games, and that's where you can find all of our videos, all of our nutshells, and how to play. If you wanted to check that out. Our website also has a lot of different like marketing resources and things like that. So it kind of goes beyond the scope of this, but we have a lot of things to kind of check out there on our retailer page. So yeah, those are probably the best ways to get a hold of us. And then in terms of buying, firesidegames.com, we also have a shop. So if you wanted to purchase anything there, we're also in lots of friendly local game stores. And of course, all the online stores. So not too hard to find us.
Nice. And do you know, Anne-Marie, are you going to be taking pitches tomorrow?
Oh, pitches?
Game
I don't know. I'll have to look into that. Is that something that's still open for us to be able to?
I don't know. I only asked because I'm pitching tomorrow, so I wanted to know if you'd be one of the publishers there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I need to look at the schedule. I was so busy, before this, I didn't even have time to. We've been going to some of the seminars, but it's been kind of at the end. So, but yeah, let me look into that and see if I can be part of the pitches. That would be great. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, Anne-Marie. So again, I was Anne-Marie's co-host tonight. My name is Dr. Dave Eng. I'm from the website universityxp.com, where I write and research about using games for teaching and learning. I also design tabletop games, and I also teach about games, game design, game studies, and ludology. You can find me at universityxp.com. You can also email me directly at dave@universityxp.com. I have a podcast called Experience Points. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts. I also have a YouTube channel also called Experience Points, where I talk about game design and using games for teaching and learning. So we are at time right now. Anne-Marie, thank you very much for joining me tonight. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for checking out our stream. I appreciate it as well. And we'll see you around next time.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.